There's the light. Well, it's great to be with you. My name is Robert. I have the privilege of being the pastor here at Fellowship. And for the kids that are in here, as my son just told me, Daddy, don't talk too long. I can't promise it will be short. But how many of you, I got to do a survey because it's Memorial Day weekend, how many of you are fans of hot dogs? If it's a hot dog or a burger, you're picking a hot dog. Oh, how many are in favor of the hamburger or cheeseburger? All right. Now, how many of you would rather just have ribs? All right. That's my camp. I don't know where you're at with it, but I feel like we're in that season where it's Memorial Day weekend. And in Michigan, we all know we have winter and road construction. Those are our two seasons. But we also have this weekend called Memorial Day weekend. And what does Memorial Day weekend often represent? It's like our official kickoff to summer. It's when we grill or we get out and we maybe enjoy being outside a little more. And it's kind of like that kickoff to summer, especially here in Michigan. But as I was reflecting on Memorial Day weekend, I was wondering, is Memorial Day weekend really about hot dogs, hamburgers, and ribs? Is it really about opening cottages? Is it really about getting on the water? Is it really about going for a hike? And while many of those traditions are what Memorial Day weekend has become, Memorial Day weekend was never actually intended for that. Memorial Day weekend started originally during the Civil War time. It was a day where they had women from both the Union and the Confederate, both white and black, didn't matter what their background was, they were taking wreaths to the graves of lost soldiers. And they would put that wreath on a grave, and they would put it there in remembrance of their life that was lost in that terrible tragedy of war. And so this became more prevalent, and they actually instituted it as a holiday. In fact, it was General John A. Logan who issued General Order Number 11, or the Memorial Day Act. This actually made it formally Memorial Day as Decoration Day. The first name of it was Decoration Day because it was a time to set aside to remember those who had been lost, to take time to go and put a decoration on a grave. As I was reflecting on Memorial Day, and as I was thinking about how this day originally came to be and how it was a day to set aside to remember those who gave it all, I couldn't help but look at our text and see Jesus call us to the very same example. That he calls us to not only set aside ourselves and our lives in acts of service, but we too are called to set aside our time to reflect on him, the one who laid it all down for us. And what is so powerful to me is that here we are gathered on a Sunday, and we gather each and every Sunday remembering just that. It's more than a day, but it's something that we're constantly coming back to. So I want to encourage you to open your Bibles to Mark chapter 10. One of these black Bibles is one that you can take. You can give it away. Please take it with you. We're going to be in Mark chapter 10, and we're going to be starting in verse 32. Almost through the chapter, we're going to get all the way to verse 45 today. But if you go all the way to the end and you look at verse 45 itself, I even have it on the screen to kind of make it easier right there. There is a verse in there that I have seen used so many times. I myself even used it before. I was doing a ceremony for fallen police officers, and this very verse is one that I used. And it's this verse where Jesus says these words, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and give his life as a ransom for many." That verse alone is one that we could spend a whole day talking about. But there's something that builds up to this verse. There's something that gets us to this point. This is an incredibly important verse for our understanding. It not only is Jesus calling himself the Son of Man, but he's talking about how he is giving his life as a ransom for many. That it's actually better to serve than to be served. In Mark chapter 8 through 10, we see some of the most intentional verses on discipleship. As we go through this whole passage, as we've been journeying through Mark chapter 8, chapter 9, and now chapter 10, what we have been seeing is constant teaching on what it looks like to actually be a follower of Jesus. What it requires of us to walk in the ways of Jesus. We can see his disciples, they're wrestling with what this looks like, and Jesus is constantly trying to help them better understand. And I would say that this verse is the climax of his teaching, where he is using the example of himself, and he's saying, look, if you want to be a follower of me, then you will be one who serves others rather than being served yourself. Those are some tough words to really digest, if we're honest. I had my undergrad in business management, as I've shared, and so in that course, you had to read leadership book after leadership book, and then, of course, you start getting, as an adult, and everything is about going to leadership seminars and learning how to be a better leader. In fact, I first set eyes on my wife. I say that because I didn't really meet her there. I was told she had a boyfriend at the time, so my hopes were crushed. But I set eyes on her at something called the Global Leadership Summit. It was like this thing where you're always learning to be a better leader. Have you maybe experienced that in your workplace, or experienced that in school, or experienced that somewhere? We're all called to be these better leaders. Well, there's this term that is often used called servant leadership. Maybe you've heard of that word, and I was in a conversation recently, and they're like, yeah, I hope this person gets the promotion over this person because they're really a servant leader. That servant leadership is something that our society has been teaching. Our society has been trying to help us to really embrace. And leadership gurus have been saying, look, this servant leadership, this is the secret sauce of leadership. This term was coined by Robert Greenleaf, and it was in 1970 he wrote an essay called The Servant as Leader. And in the essay he says, the servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first, as opposed to wanting power, influence, fame, or wealth. Think about anyone you've worked for, anyone that you've seen as a solid leader in your life. You often want to work with someone who gets into the trenches with you. You often want to work with someone who is willing to get their hands dirty too. You don't want to often work for someone that sits in a high ivory tower and just tells you out of their power or out of their abundance how to do things or what to do. It's in those circumstances that people often grow resentful, or they have resentment towards their boss or their leader, whoever it is. But it's when they're working alongside that person, there's a lot more respect. Maybe you have seen this. And so this is something that you'll hear TED Talks on, or you'll hear at seminars, or you'll hear leaders saying. But here's the reality of it all. Robert Greenleaf did not coin this term. He may have put it into the English language. He may have put it into an essay. But I believe servant leadership was first taught through Jesus Christ. He showed us that his leadership style was one of servant leadership. That he was one who got himself in the trenches. That he was one who made himself one of us. That he was one who served by example. It was Jesus' ministry, his life, ultimately his death and his resurrection that showed this to us. And this is what our passage is all about. We get an inner looking into the leadership of Jesus, and then we can see how that applies to us. So look at verse 32 with me. We're going to go back up to the beginning in verse 32. It says, now they were on their way up to Jerusalem. Now it says up to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was on a hill, so they would travel up to Jerusalem, literally up the hill, right, to Jerusalem. And if you even read some of the Psalms, there's a section called the Psalms of Ascent. And this is as the Jews were making their pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. They would sing these psalms or these songs of ascent as they were ascending to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage. So they're on their way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. I love this because it shows an example of a leader. Jesus is the one in front, right? If we see a leader, you could be the one kind of from behind yelling orders, or you can be the one up in front. We see Jesus is up in front. He is leading them to Jerusalem. And here they continue. The disciples, they're filled with awe, it tells us. Probably marveling at many of the teachings Jesus has done, probably amazed at what was going on. And the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. There's two ways that we can approach God, and one isn't right and one isn't wrong. I think we have to approach him with both. The one is awe. Awe, wow, how powerful, how wonderful, how amazing God is. The other one is with fear. He is the Almighty God. He is the giver and taker of life. He is the one who is supreme to all of us. There is a healthy fear that we have. We're told that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom or all understanding. We should have awe of God, how amazing, how marvelous, how glorious, how incredible he is. We should also have fear. We see both of those present in this situation. It goes on. Taking the 12 disciples aside, so now Jesus says, okay, here's the crowd, let's keep them back there. Let me take the 12 disciples aside. Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him. This is the third time now that Jesus is going to predict something. This is the third time that he's going to say, do you get it now? This is the third time that he's going to say, look, this is about to happen to me. I believe as Jesus was preparing to say these words, he was also focused on the scriptures that he knew were in the Old Testament, that he knew would be fulfilled. I believe he may have been thinking of Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4-7, where it says, "The sovereign Lord has given me his words of wisdom so that I know how to comfort the weary. Morning by morning he wakens me and opens my understanding to his will. The sovereign Lord has spoken to me and I have listened. I have not rebelled or turned away. I have offered my back to those who beat me and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mockery and spitting. Because the sovereign Lord's helped me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore, I have set my face like stone, determined to do his will, and I know that I will not be put to shame." As Jesus is walking to Jerusalem, he knows he is walking into his death sentence. He also knows he's walking to the cross. He also knows that he's walking to a place that frees you and I. But most importantly, he knows he's walking in the will of God the Father. And no matter what is going to await him, he is leading them into this battle. It's in verses 33 and 34, it says, "Listen, we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed by the leading priests and teachers of religious law." All of a sudden he says, look, we're going up to Jerusalem, where what is going to happen? The Son of Man, me, Jesus, will be betrayed by the leading priests and the teachers of the religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days he will rise again. A couple things. One, I'm like, man, Jesus, you're talking in the third person here. This is kind of interesting. But the other side is it's a very serious thing where Jesus is saying, look, this is about to happen. And for the first time, he actually identifies who it will be that will betray him. And who does he say will betray him? It will be the religious leaders and the priests. Can you imagine being a Jew at the time? You have been understanding, respecting, looking up to these rabbis, Pharisees, Sadducees, these teachers. And all of a sudden, Jesus says, look, those are the people who will turn their back on me. Those are some powerful words for Jesus. But not only that, he tells us that he's going to be mocked, he's going to be whipped, he's going to be spit on, and ultimately he's going to be put to death. These are not just small words for Jesus to be sharing with the disciples. These are heavy words for them to hear. He ends it with hope when he says, but after 3 days he will rise again. There is victory, but there's also cost that comes before the victory. See, if we look at Jesus' leadership, if we look at what servant leaders do, if we ourselves are to walk in the ways of Jesus, let me be honest, we have to start here. Servant leaders consider the cost. Servant leaders know what it is going to cost them to serve. When a man or woman signs up for the military, they know that they are signing up to go into battle. In fact, that's what they're going to train for. That's what they're going to do. They're signing up to put themselves literally in the ways of bullets. They're signing up not knowing what tomorrow is going to bring. And I think that there is a place where we have to have a respect and an honor for those who would sign up, because I don't know, honestly, could we do that ourselves sometimes? That is a lot to sign up for. I think of my cousin who is in the Green Beret, one of the special forces, and I'm amazed because I'm always like, that's my little cousin that I would not be like 10 feet from now after all his training. But I always think of that because he not only signed up for the army or for the military, he signed up to go into the places that no one else will go to. That is amazing to think about. But then I think about it in our faith perspective. And follow me. As Christians, we also sign up to be a part of an army. We sign up to go into a battle. And while we might not fight flesh and blood, we fight spiritual principalities of this dark world. And when you say yes to Jesus, when you say yes to following him, you're also saying yes to being a part of his army. And you're saying yes to a battle that you're going to have to face. I know I'm so uplifting on this Memorial Day. But the reality is, as Christians, we have to look at what our leader Jesus saw in front of him. And we can't be naive to what would lie in front of us. Jesus saw in Jerusalem what was coming. It wasn't nice dinners and receptions with clients. It wasn't whining and dining out of power and wealth. It wasn't what we often see in our leaders, where it's all of these fancy things around us and how we can lavish other things on others to try to win their business transaction. That's not what Jesus was doing as a leader, was he? What he saw coming in Jerusalem was betrayal, beatings, mockings, even death. And Jesus knew who would turn on him. It wouldn't be the ones who were his known enemies. It would eventually be Rome, but the Jews, they did despise the Romans. They wanted the Messiah to set them free from Rome. But Jesus says what? It would be first the religious leaders that would turn him over to the Romans. It would be his own people. It would be the people who were claiming to worship the one true God. It would be the ones who were saying that they were obeying the laws. It would be like the rich young ruler who we had just read in the previous week about how he said, you know what, I've done all these things. I've followed these commandments. It would be those good, holy people who would turn on Jesus. And despite the betrayal by his own people, despite the pain that would happen, Jesus was focused on the mission at hand and where he was heading. When you think of following Jesus, it's very important for you to not just go into it as this is going to be amazing, which it will be. We'll get there. But you have to first count the cost. At my previous church, when I was doing youth ministry, I had a lead pastor who he did a lot of mission work in China. And it was very eye-opening to hear about the stories of what happened when he went and he helped train leaders over in China. For instance, every week you hear me say to give this Bible away, to take this home with you, to read it and understand it. Because he shared a story about a young girl in China who would cover her head with 5 blankets and a flashlight just so she could read this. And if she was caught with this, it was 5 years minimum in prison. Think about that. I always ask, what is the harm of this if it's not the true Word of God? But just to be able to have this is something that sometimes we don't recognize. And then he shared a story about the church leaders who were imprisoned, who had this taken away. And they said, that's why we memorize it. Because they can take this away from us, but they can't take away what's on our heart. You see, when we prepare for battle, when we prepare to follow Christ, we have to understand that there is a real battle that takes place. That as Christians, we claim to have the truth. We do have the truth. And guess what? Satan doesn't want people to know that. And so he's going to do everything he can to try to get in the way of the advancement of the kingdom of God. But here's the great news. Did you know that the church is growing rapidly in China? Did you know that the largest church in the world is actually in South Korea? Did you know that there are Christians in the kingdom of God growing in places like India, Bangladesh, China? The places in this world where they're trying to snuff out the faith is where it is on the most growth fire path. As Americans, we have a lot of freedoms. But we have to also be willing to say, you know what? Do we even know the cost of what others around the world have? Because I believe it's when we count the cost that our faith becomes all the more purified. It becomes refined. It becomes more on fire because we begin to see the power of it overcoming the darkness. In 1 Peter chapter 5, it was kind of crazy because I was preparing my sermon, and one of my mentors called me, and he said, hey, you know what? I need to bug you. I said, please, I'm already behind on my message. Like, can you call me another time? He's like, no, you need to hear this. I'm like, okay. He's like, I need you to read. Have you read 1 Peter? I'm like, yeah, this morning I read 1 Peter chapter 1, 2, and 3. That's kind of weird. What are you trying to get to? And he said, just skip chapter 4. And I need you to go to chapter 5. And I'm like, all right, I'll read chapter 5 after I prepare my sermon. He's like, no, hang up this phone and read chapter 5. And so I'm in the middle of kind of like wrestling through this whole thing on battles and what's happening and how do we count the costs. And then I read these words in 1 Peter 5, 8, and 9. Stay alert. Watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Stand firm against him and be strong in your faith. Remember that your family of believers all over the world is going through the same kind of suffering you are. Back in the early church, Peter is writing and he's saying, look, stay focused, stay alert, stay on the prowl, because guess what? Satan, he wants to attack you, but you're not the only one going through this. All of your brothers and sisters, they're going through it too. There is a cost to calling on Jesus. But there's also a blessing. Look at what verse 10 says. In his kindness, God called you to share in his eternal glory by means of Christ Jesus. So after you suffered a little while, just a little while, after you suffer just a little while, he will restore, support, and strengthen you. And he will place you on a firm foundation. Man, that is some powerful words. I think of the story that Jesus tells of a storm that beats against a house. And he says that the house that was built on sand, it collapses, it falls into the water. Maybe you know this story. But the house that was built on bedrock, it can withstand the winds and the waves. It can withstand the beatings that come across it. When we understand we're going to have winds that come at us, we're going to have waves that come at us, but if our foundation is built on Jesus, nothing will destroy us. Nothing. Those are some powerful words. But in order for that to happen, we have to have the mindset of Christ. In order for our foundation to be that of Christ, we must also walk in the ways of Christ, because he didn't just show us a way, he showed us the way. And he wanted us to understand how it would be to navigate this world best. How do you get through this messy, windy world best? Well, first, you follow in the example of how he did it. He was a servant, as verse 45 told us. But here's the thing, servanthood isn't natural. Verses 35 and 37 continue. Jesus has his moment, right? He all right, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to die. Don't worry, 3 days later I'm going to rise. But after all my beatings and all of that. So James and John, the sons of Zebedee, they come over and they spoke with him. Just take this in for a second. He just has this, you're in tears, right? You're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is going to happen to you, Jesus. This would be me. No way. And James and John, they're like, all right, come here, Jesus. Teacher, they said, we want you to do us a favor. Did he not just say, I'm going to do this favor for you. I'm going to lay my whole life down for him. And they're like, we want you to do us a favor. What do you think their favor is going to be? Well, Jesus asked, what is your request? I mean, come on. Let's think about this. Can I do it instead of you, Jesus? That would be a servant leader, right? Jesus, can I take your place? Oh, Jesus, can I, go ahead and tell you who's going to betray you? Can I, spy him out? Something to serve him? No, they replied like us sinful human beings would reply. When you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in the places of honor. Us first, Jesus. When you get there, remember me. Because we want to be next to you, they say. One on your right and the other on your left. Legitimately put this into the context and think, how crazy are James and John? Well, they're just as crazy as you and I, because the natural way of being human is what? To put ourselves first. And they want to know, when I get to heaven, please give me that seat of honor. Please give me that great place there. I can't believe that they're literally sitting there and they're saying, okay, Jesus, that's great. After you make that sacrifice, what's in it for me? I often get asked why we have for Macomb and for the world on our door. Why is that a heartbeat of our church? Because the natural question is, if we serve our county and if we serve the people around us and we love on the less fortunate, then they will come to our church, they will grow our numbers, and they will be a part of our body. That is our natural thinking. If I give you this, what can I get in return? But the reason we're for Macomb is because we want nothing in return. We just want them to know the love of Jesus. And the more that we can show people the love of Jesus without asking for anything back, is the more that they will understand the authenticity and the realness that there is a God who hears their cries and knows what they're going through. We serve not so that they will come. We serve because we simply have a heart to serve. We love not expecting something in return. We love unconditionally, because unconditional love means there is no condition to it. When we say we're for them, we truly want it to be a heartbeat of our church where servanthood is what takes place. And so many of you do this day in and day out. It's the honest perspective of what can we do for you without asking for anything in return from you. Jesus had to remind James and John of this very thing, about what servanthood was all about. So he uses a cup and he uses baptism. It's in verse 38 that he goes on, but Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you are asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I am about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering I must baptize with?" He asks them, are you able to drink of this cup? Are you able to be baptized into this suffering? We'll get into those. And how do they respond? Oh, yes, of course we are able. We are willing. Yeah, we're here, Jesus, as long as we get that place on that glorious throne. Then Jesus told them, "You will indeed drink from my bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering. But I have no right to say who will sit on my right or on my left. God has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen." Think about this. When Jesus was on the cross, there was a man on his right, and there was a man on his left, and it wasn't James and John, but it was two guilty men who deserved that cross. And in the middle of it was Jesus, who did not deserve it. And what does he do? He looks to the man on the one side and he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Why? Because in that moment he realized he was truly God. He asked God, Jesus, like, what about me? Like, please, like, just look, I don't I deserve this. You don't deserve this. You truly are the Son of God. And in professing him, Jesus says, guess what? Today you're going to be with me in paradise. There's a beautiful picture there of our redemption that happens on that cross, right there with Jesus in the middle of those two criminals. And then you have the disciples, who the disciples are like the ones who had been working all day in the parable of the talents. They're the ones who've been working all that day, all from sunup to sundown. And that guy on the cross, he's like the dude who showed up for the last 30 minutes of the shift. And what does Jesus say? They all get the same wages. Whether you work the 12-hour day or whether you work 30 minutes, you get the same wage. And the disciples are the ones who they're wondering, but we've been walking with you. We've given up everything for you. Don't we get better wages? And Jesus has said to them, you are going to drink of my cup of suffering, and you are going to be baptized in my baptism of suffering. Drinking the cup is a powerful illustration because it showed that you had the same fate as another. I remember in Mark 14, we'll get to it, where Jesus says, "Abba, Father," this is in the garden, "everything is possible for you. Please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not your will." Jesus shared of this cup of wine, the one we take with communion all the time when we remember his covenant he made. He shared that with his disciples. And they knew that there would also have to come struggle, pain, by sharing this cup of suffering with Jesus. Drinking the cup throughout the Old Testament was seen as a picture of God's judgment and wrath. Psalm 75, Isaiah 51, those are just a few examples of how this cup is a picture of God's judgment and wrath. Jesus is saying, look, this cup here, this is God's judgment on the world. Are you willing? Are you willing to take this up with me? Because we don't want that wrath coming. We want a way through. He also talks about the baptism of suffering. I love how Psalm 69 says, "Deeper and deeper I sink into mire. I can't find a foothold. I am in deep water, and the floods overwhelm me." When we see baptism, we see the picture of immersion, completely buried in the water. Jesus is saying, look, you're going to be buried in the suffering with me. Jesus reassures James and John that they would suffer just as he did. And what we see in Acts chapter 12 is James would go on to be the first of the 12 that was martyred. Pretty powerful when you see it all come together. Tim Keller said, "We have a God who through suffering came to glory, and we have therefore our own path that through suffering, and only through suffering, do we come to glory as well." I hate to say this, church, because I love you, I care about you, and I don't want anyone to suffer. But it's been the pain in my life that has shown me God in the greatest forms. It has been through the hardship and the worry and the struggle that I have seen the God who provides. I have seen the God who comforts. I have seen the God of peace. This world, it does have many trials, but take heart, I have overcome the world, he says. We use this all the time. Why? Because I hope and encourage you in your suffering that you see Christ. Because the only way through your suffering is Christ. That is the only way that we will get through the ups and the downs, the left turns and right turns, the unexpected turns. And if we're to be like a servant like Christ, we say no to the world and yes to God. Look at what happens next. In verse 41, it's not just about James and John. Remember, there's 10 others. So the 10 other heard what James and John had asked, and they were indignant. I would be too. Like, James, seriously, you asked to be on his right? Like, oh, John, did you ask to be on his right? Who was asking to be on his right? Who's going to be on his left? What about me? Can you imagine? Like, they're like pretty ticked, right? Like, what about us? There's 12 of us, dude, not just the 2 of you. So Jesus called them together like a good coach, and he said, let's have a little teamwork here. But catch these words, because these are, you ever wonder how do you know the Bible is truth? Right here. You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people. How often do you see this? Well, I am the leader, so thus shall it be. Oh, I have the power, so it should be this way. Oh, I have the money, so it should be this way. Let me lord over my power and my position over you. That's what the people of the world do. And officials, they flaunt their authority over those under them. But catch these words. But among you it will be different. The world says to brag about your power. The world says to brag about your wealth. The world says to flaunt it and to use it as an authority over others. But Jesus says, but you are to be different. That means opposite of that. You're not to be the one that flaunts it. You know, we live in a world of influencers and trying to tell who is going to be the self-promoter, who's going to be the one that says, I've got it all together and you shall do this or do that. We're all about authority and status in our world. And our world has always been that way. It didn't take Instagram, TikTok, YouTube to create that. It happened in Jesus' day. And people have always desired to take that power and to lord it over others. Nothing has changed. But Jesus says, among you, it will be different. Let's go back to Greenleaf's quote. The servant leader is a servant first. It begins with a natural feeling that one wants to serve. I would argue that there's not a natural feeling to want to serve, that we have to truly embrace that call to serve first as opposed to wanting power, influence, fame, or wealth. Jesus says, among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be a servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be a slave to everyone else. Did Jesus not describe servant leadership right there? Did he just not show the example of what we're called to be? God himself showed this leadership when he gave up his only son for us. As William Lane says, the reversal of all human ideas of greatness and rank was achieved when Jesus came, not to be served, but to serve. I love how J.C. Ryle puts it. The world's idea of greatness is to rule, but Christian greatness consists in serving. When I looked at my senior yearbook from high school, it did not say who would be the greatest servant in the class. It was most likely to be president. There's a difference, right? Who's going to achieve wealth, status, and authority? There was no option for that person who was going to do the opposite of that. Jesus says, don't achieve, go for this. Go for the servanthood. Don't try to rule and have power. Go to the place of serving others. And so I leave you with this. We're to follow the example of Jesus. The verse we started with, verse 45. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life for a ransom for many. To make a few things clear, number one, Jesus didn't owe anyone anything. He had no deal he had to reconcile. He had no bargain he had to agree to. He had no plea deal, none of that. Jesus owed no one anything. Some may argue that he had some ransom payment to be paid to Satan, but that doesn't align with the Bible whatsoever. In fact, it's in Hebrews 12:2 that it says, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. He's the one who initiates it. He's the one who perfects it. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated at the place of honor beside God's throne. Jesus did this all willingly. He initiated it. And Jesus went to the cross with joy. He endured the suffering with hope and willingness. As John 18 says, no one can take my life from me, Jesus says. I sacrifice it voluntarily. For I have the authority to lay it down when I want to and also to take it up again. For this is what my Father has commanded. The first thing we have to understand is Jesus didn't do this to try to get out of something or situation. He did it because he wanted to. And also, Jesus came to us. Verse 45 has some of the most powerful words in it. And I don't want to leave without you hearing these. The Son of Man came. Hear those words. The Son of Man came. In order for him to come, he had to leave somewhere. There was somewhere that he was before. He came. It wasn't he was born. It wasn't that he started. He always was. As Revelation 22 says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. It is so clear in Scripture that Jesus always was and always will be, and yet he chose to leave a throne for you and I. He chose to endure suffering. He chose to endure pain. He chose to set this example for us. Why? Because the verse says, to give his life as a ransom for many. This is what theologians will call the great exchange or the wonderful exchange. Ransom is paid when someone is exchanging something, usually money, to free someone else of a situation. How do you get a hostage out? How do you get those situations out, right? Someone is trapped and you free them with something else. Well, we've been trapped in this world of ugliness called sin because of Adam and Eve, and we've been in this prison right there. But yet, Jesus paid a ransom to free us of that. He came down so that you and I may be lifted up. This Memorial Day, we're to remember those who died in war. We're to remember those who laid it down so that we could have freedoms. I know that this world likes to debate that right now. But the reality is we're very blessed to have what we have. And I think we often take that for granted. And so I pray that we don't spend this Memorial Day forgetting about those who have given us the ability to have this in our homes and to read this and to gather in a church like this. There's been a lot that has made that possible. But I hope that we don't leave and just worship human beings for what they've done. I hope we look to the greatest example of Jesus, who did that very thing. I'll leave you with this, Philippians 2:3, because if we're to walk in the ways of Jesus, I believe we would walk out this verse. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking as others better than yourselves. On this Memorial Day, you might not have a battle that you're fighting in with bullet and guns, but you have a battle that you're fighting of spiritual darkness. How can you be a servant to others this Memorial Day? How can you lift others up by serving them? Will you pray with me?